Have you ever stopped to wonder how it's possible that almost every country on earth is drowning in debt, yet somehow there is always someone willing to lend even more? If nations owe trillions upon trillions of dollars, then who exactly is standing at the other end of the transaction, holding the world's IOUs? Welcome to Financial Empire, where we uncover the hidden stories behind money, power, and history. And today, we're following one of the greatest financial mysteries ever, asked a question that has sparked endless debates, conspiracy theories, and misunderstandings. If every country is in debt, who's the creditor? To answer that, we must travel back thousands of years, long before skyscrapers, stock exchanges, and central banks existed, to a time when debt wasn't recorded on computers, but carved into clay tablets. Around 4,000 years ago, in ancient Mesopotamia, merchants and farmers borrowed grain and silver from temples and wealthy landowners. Debt wasn't invented by modern banks, it was born alongside civilization itself. Kings understood something extraordinary. Lending allowed economies to grow because people could plant crops before harvest, build ships before trade, and wage wars before collecting taxes. But debt also carried danger. Entire families lost their land, their freedom, and sometimes even became slaves when they couldn't repay what they owed. This cycle repeated across ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe. Debt was never simply about money. It was about trust. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and something revolutionary happened. Powerful banking families like the Medici transformed lending into an organized business. Kings no longer relied solely on taxes. They borrowed from bankers to finance wars and kingdoms. Suddenly, nations themselves became borrowers. The more powerful a kingdom appeared, the more lenders were willing to finance it. Yet, this relationship was risky. If a king lost a war or refused to repay his debts, entire banking empires collapsed. History is filled with bankrupt monarchs and ruined financiers. But humanity kept lending, because economic growth often outweighed the risks. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, an explosion of railways, factories, steamships, and global trade. Governments borrowed enormous sums to build infrastructure that transformed societies. Investors bought government bonds because they were considered relatively safe. A government bond is simply a promise. Lend us money today, and we'll repay you with interest tomorrow. This simple promise became one of the foundations of modern finance. But here's where the mystery begins to unravel. When people hear that the United States owes more than $30 trillion, or Japan owes over twice the size of its economy, they imagine one giant creditor sitting somewhere counting mountains of cash. Reality is far more fascinating. Governments don't borrow from one mysterious organization. They borrow from millions of different creditors simultaneously. Imagine buying a government bond with your retirement savings. In that moment, you become one of the country's creditors. Pension funds become creditors. Insurance companies become creditors. Banks become creditors. Investment funds become creditors. Even ordinary families become creditors without realizing it because their pension plans and mutual funds often own government bonds. But the story doesn't stop there. Countries also lend money to each other. China owns significant amounts of US Treasury securities. Japan owns enormous quantities as well. European investors buy American debt, while American investors buy European debt. Governments, corporations, and financial institutions are interconnected in a vast web where nearly everyone is simultaneously a borrower and a lender. Picture an enormous spider's web stretching across the globe. Every thread represents loans flowing from one nation, company, or investor to another. Pull one thread and the entire network trembles. That's exactly why financial crises spread so rapidly across continents. During the 2008 financial crisis, banks stopped trusting one another. Credit froze, businesses struggled to borrow, and economies around the world slowed almost overnight. Debt wasn't the enemy. The sudden disappearance of trust was. But what about central banks? Surely they must be the ultimate creditors. Not exactly. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, often purchase government bonds as part of monetary policy. When they do, they become creditors too. However, Unlike ordinary investors seeking profits, central banks aim to stabilize economies, control inflation, and support financial markets. During crises, they may buy massive quantities of government debt to keep borrowing costs low. This has led many people to believe governments simply print money to erase debt. Yet, printing excessive money creates another problem: inflation. History offers painful lessons. In Germany, during the Weimar Republic, money became so worthless that workers rushed to spend their wages before prices doubled again. Zimbabwe experienced similar hyperinflation decades later. More recently, Venezuela demonstrated how excessive money creation can devastate an economy. Debt may seem frightening, but reckless attempts to eliminate it can be even more destructive. Here's another twist. Governments rarely repay all their debt at once. Instead, they refinance it. Imagine having a mortgage. Rather than paying the entire amount immediately, you make regular payments over decades. Governments operate similarly. When old bonds mature, they often issue new ones to repay the previous creditors. As long as investors trust the government, this cycle can continue for generations. In fact, some countries have carried debt continuously for centuries. Britain's national debt stretches back hundreds of years, surviving wars, revolutions, and economic transformations. The key isn't having zero debt, it's maintaining the confidence of lenders. Confidence is the invisible currency that powers the global financial system. Lose it, and borrowing becomes expensive or impossible. Keep it, and investors continue lending because they believe they'll be repaid. This explains why wealthy nations often borrow at lower interest rates than poorer countries. It's not simply about wealth, it's about credibility. Investors evaluate political stability, economic growth, legal institutions, and the government's history of repayment. Every bond sold reflects a vote of confidence in a nation's future. Now, consider the world's total debt, which exceeds hundreds of trillions of dollars when governments, businesses, and households are combined. This number sounds terrifying until you realize that every debt is someone else's asset. Your savings account exists because your bank lends money. Your pension fund grows because it owns investments, including government bonds. Insurance companies hold debt. Universities hold debt investments. Sovereign wealth funds hold debt. Debt circulates through the financial system, like blood through the human body. Remove it entirely, and modern economies would struggle to function. Of course, excessive debt can become dangerous. Countries like Greece experienced severe debt crises when investors lost confidence and borrowing costs skyrocketed. Argentina has defaulted multiple times throughout its history, demonstrating how fragile trust can become. When confidence disappears, governments face painful choices: raise taxes, reduce spending, seek international assistance, or restructure their obligations. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund often step in during such crises, providing emergency loans under strict economic conditions. Yet even the IMF isn't funded by magic. Its resources come from contributions made by member countries. Once again, the creditors are nations supporting one another through international institutions. So, if every country is in debt, who's the creditor? The astonishing answer is that, in many ways, we all are. Every worker with a retirement account, every teacher with a pension, every investor holding government bonds, every insurance policy, every bank deposit, every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank, every financial institution, and every nation participating in global markets forms part of this immense financial network. The world's debt doesn't point toward a single hidden master controlling everything. Instead, it reveals something even more remarkable: a civilization built upon trust, promises, and confidence, extending across borders, generations, and economies. Every loan reflects faith in tomorrow. Every bond represents a belief that the future will be productive enough to repay today's borrowing. The next time you hear that a country owes trillions of dollars, remember that behind those staggering numbers are millions of ordinary people, institutions, and governments connected through invisible promises. The creditor isn't one mysterious figure sitting atop the financial world. The creditor is a vast, interconnected network of humanity itself, proving that the global economy survives not because debt exists, but because trust continues to hold it together. And perhaps that is the greatest financial story in history. Not that the world owes money, but that billions of people continue believing in one another enough to keep lending, investing, building, and moving civilization forward.